Hey, Chris, I appreciate you talking to us today. It's really an honor to talk
Thanks,
to
Alan.
you.
It's great to be here. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, I've called you today to talk about a new ebook that you're offering that's on doing testing nutritional status, and you've set it up as a hypertext, hyperlinked cheat sheet in your own words, which is a really powerful tool, and it's one of the best uses I've seen in terms of being able to have concise reading and being able to jump out to detail or actually be able to read about and order supplements you may need or tests you may need. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this the purpose of this is to try to bring all the practical stuff, all the how-to stuff about optimizing your balance and status of vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids in a way that is super practical. And the background to this was last year, by popular demand on my podcast, I was doing a series about testing nutritional status because a lot of people want to get a better grapple on whether they're getting the right balance of their nutrients, but there's a lot of different opinions about how to figure that out. And what I was finding was that I would put 2 weeks of work into doing a podcast episode about one nutrient, and that podcast episode would be about 2 hours long, and it would go into all the science and it would go into all the practical details and stuff. And I got about, 6 or 7 of these done last year, and I had to take a break from it because it was taking me so long to put together one episode. And so some people who just loved everything about them were kind of on a cliffhanger. They're like, well, you told me about selenium, but how do I measure my vitamin A status and things like that? And then there were other problems. One was maybe you loved listening to it for 2 hours, but maybe you're trying to convince your uncle that he needs more folate in his diet, and you're not going to convince your uncle to listen to a 2 hour podcast about folate in order to convince him to eat more vegetables. And so there was some need to translate this into something much more distilled into its practical essence. The other problem with it was, even though I laid out the practical implications of everything in these podcast episodes, it was hard to find it. So I had a close colleague of mine email me and say, hey, every time I'm trying to figure out what I should be measuring or what the ranges should be, I'm going down to your podcast and I'm hunting through this 2 hour transcript to try to find out what should the range of plasma selenium be? Should it be above this or below that? You should sell a PDF that's just got all the ranges and everything that you recommend in like one page.
Mm.
And so I go to put this together, and I found that it was even hard for me and for my people on my team who were helping me to find my own recommendations in the podcast. So that really reinforced that something cheat sheet oriented was needed. But then as I'm putting it together, I'm realizing, these, like, to say that plasma selenium is the best marker of selenium status and that it should be at least above 90 and it shouldn't be above 140 it's useful, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't connect it to the other forms of evidence. Because all these, if we're going to talk about blood tests or urine tests or ranges that things should be in, that's really powerful when it's taken into the context of someone's experience, meaning how, do they exhibit signs and symptoms of nutrient deficiencies or toxicities or imbalances? And it's really meaningful in the context of looking at your own or someone else's diet and lifestyle. And when you combine those, that's really powerful, but none of those things are that powerful only on their own. So to take as an example, you might have someone who has patches of dry skin, and you might see that this person has no intake of oysters in their diet. They don't eat any red meat. They don't eat cheese. They eat a lot more plants than animal products, and they have a really high intake of whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes, and they don't practice fermentation or sprouting or anything around this. And you might then measure their plasma zinc because you're going to do that anyway, or you recognize that their dietary pattern and one of their chief symptoms might indicate zinc deficiency, and you find that their plasma zinc is comes back flagged as low. Well, then it's really obvious that this person is zinc deficient. And if you give them a zinc supplement or you have them eat oysters on a several times a week and all of a sudden their dry skin disappears, then it's even more clear that you've successfully fixed a zinc deficiency. But you can have any one of those things not be the case, and you need all the other forms of evidence. So, for example, if you look at a plasma zinc test, it's going to tell usually the bottom of the reference range is somewhere around 50 or 54. But in studies where they've actually taken people who weren't zinc deficient and they've given them a zinc deficient diet and they've just sort of like locked them in a college dorm room and observed them like they were lab rats and measured their plasma zinc, watch it fall, and just wait for the first symptoms to emerge. Generally in most people, the first sign or symptom is these patches of dry skin, but they start happening when your plasma zinc is between 70 and 75. So if you ordered a plasma zinc test, it could have told you that it was totally normal and the person would still be deficient. Further, that's just what's usual. Maybe you get someone who has their plasma zinc at 75 or 80, and according to the average, that shouldn't be deficient. But if you look at their dietary pattern and you recognize that diets that don't have oysters, beef, and cheese, that are really high in plant products, really low in animal products, and that have lots of unsoaked, unfermented whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes in them, are characteristic of zinc deficient diets, and you recognize that patches of dry skin is most commonly the first sign of zinc deficiency, then you don't really need to know their plasma zinc. You can suspect it very strongly. And if you just add a zinc supplement or you add a good source of dietary zinc and you watch it disappear, then you've confirmed that regardless of what the plasma zinc test says. On the other hand, you may have someone who had 6 months of diarrhea and their diet looks great. And you wouldn't know that they were zinc deficient unless you measured it in plasma, because what happened was when they had 6 months of diarrhea, they lost a lot of bile in their diarrhea, and that bile carried the zinc right out of their body. And even though they eat oysters and they eat beef and they eat cheese and they don't eat all the other problems that we were talking about, they're still zinc deficient. And it's really clear because you measured the plasma zinc and it came back 50. And so you really knew how to fix that situation. But you can have something else. Maybe there's nothing obvious about why the person would be maldigesting anything, and they have a genetic mutation or some variant in the gene for a zinc transporter where they just don't absorb zinc very well, and they're going to become zinc deficient unless they have supplemental zinc in their diet. That's not as common, but if you measured the plasma zinc, you would see it, and you wouldn't see it from looking at the diet. So I'm putting together this cheat sheet, and I'm like, how do I preserve the cheat sheet nature of this and yet actually explain the things that you need to know? And so and that's where the hyperlinks come in that you mentioned before. I made it so that if you're starting to try to do something with this, you only need to read a couple pages. But in an algorithmic way, whatever you get out of those couple pages, it will lead you kind of in a choose your own adventure way to say, if this happens, read this section, you click the link and it goes right to it. So everything you need to know in 78 pages is all in one place, but you may only ever have to read 3 or 4.
Okay.
And that's the idea behind it.
Okay, well that's completely awesome. And then you set up plans for people who want to learn about their deficiencies or about their nutritional status through lab testing, or they want to determine their nutritional status and they don't necessarily have the funds to do it through lab testing. You lay out, I guess, protocols for them.
Yeah, so here's the thing. if you wanted to never miss a thing so that you're 100% confident in your conclusions, then you really want to run comprehensive lab testing, and you really want to do a full dietary analysis, even to the point of weighing your food for a week and tracking everything you eat and putting it into a program that can tell you where your micronutrient intakes, meaning where your vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids are relative to the average recommended requirement. And you want to measure your blood pressure, which can be an important index of your electrolyte balance. And you want to go through the index of the signs and symptoms of nutritional imbalances, deficiencies, toxicities, bad ratios, etc. And you want to take all of that in and consider it. But different people have different resources available to them. If you take all the most rigorous markers of nutritional status and you put them all together, like I put them all in one page in this cheat sheet, then if your insurance doesn't cover that and you're paying out of pocket, you're probably going to cough up a couple $1,000s. Not everyone can afford that, right? Most people cannot afford that. By contrast, maybe money is not an issue to you. Maybe you routinely put down $2,000 a month for your health because you're doing consulting, you're doing concierge medicine, you're running all these tests that insurance doesn't cover, and that's just normal for you. But you work 12 hours a day, and time is of the essence, and you don't have any time to track your food, for example. Well, you're not the average person, but you also have resource constraints, and you need to work with the resource constraints that you have in that case. So what I outlined was 3 approaches. One is the comprehensive approach, where you just do everything. That gives you the highest quality information to get to the right conclusion fastest. But then there's the time-saving approach, which is you have plenty of money, you have plenty of resources, or your insurance just covers everything with no copay, so there's no money involved really, or whatever, and you don't have time. In that case, what you want to do is do the testing, collect a catalog of what you're experiencing in terms of signs and symptoms that could indicate a health problem, and use that information, and only do a dietary analysis when you actually need to, in order to ferret out like 2 or 3 competing possibilities that seem equally plausible without actually doing the dietary analysis. And then the cost-saving approach basically does the same thing but flipped around. It says don't run any lab tests unless your dietary analysis and your cataloging of your signs and symptoms suggests 2 competing possibilities that you need to run tests in order to differentiate. And that's especially, and in this case, let's say, and I think the majority of people fall into this case, the people who need the cost-saving approach. And for those people, it's not necessarily you need to run the test just because there's different possibilities. It may be the case that there is 0 risk and all upside benefit to just acting on every possibility at once. But there are cases where you might have equal downside risk to the upside if you act on the wrong thing. And one example I like to use is some of the signs and symptoms of iron overload are the same as the signs and symptoms of iron deficiency.
Okay.
So, for example, you could feel fatigued. You could feel out of breath when you exercise without, where it doesn't seem like you should be out of breath. Maybe your hair is falling out. Maybe you have, pain in strange places. Maybe you have menstrual problems. All of these things could happen in iron deficiency anemia and the other associated problems with iron deficiency or iron overload. And some people can be at risk for both of these, and it shifts at different times in their life. For example, you could have a woman who has the genes for hemochromatosis, which is a disorder where you're unable to regulate how much iron you absorb from food, and it accumulates and causes problems in your body. That woman might have decades of protection against iron overload or hemochromatosis because she has sufficient blood loss during menstruation. And she may actually lose enough blood during menstruation that she develops anemia several times in her life. But then she may stop menstruating, and that could be because she hit menopause or perimenopause, or it could be because she developed amenorrhea from some other issue. For example, maybe she has hypothalamic amenorrhea due to restrictive dieting and too much exercise, and that's when your brain perceives that you don't have enough energy for fertility, and so it just down regulates your fertility and you stop menstruating. So any of these possibilities that cause a big difference to change in how much blood you lose on a regular basis, all of a sudden you could not only lose your predisposition to anemia, but now the fact that you're not losing iron and you can't regulate how much you absorb from your food, and maybe you're eating a lot of iron in your diet, all of a sudden within maybe a few years, you now become vulnerable to iron overload. And in that case, it can be dangerous because if the person believes that whenever they feel fatigued, when they eat more red meat and they eat other iron-rich foods, they feel better, they may hit a point in their life where they feel fatigued, and the more red meat and the more other iron-rich foods that they put in their diet, the worse they feel. But they just think that they're not doing enough, so they double down or triple down. In that case, testing your iron status is critical because it helps you differentiate between those possibilities.
Okay. And so for a real low ball person, it's and just focusing on this particular case, the kind of
Sure.
iron level test that they give you when you go to give blood for the Red Cross, that doesn't meet these goals.
I'm sorry, say what iron test? Serum iron?
Pardon?
So one it first of all, it depends what testing you get regularly. So in many people's practices, you may have a complete blood count tested once a year in your annual physical. A lot of people don't get that, and a lot of doctors recommend against that on a cost-saving basis, but it is common to get a complete blood count once a year, and that's going to give you measures of whether you are anemic. So you might see low hemoglobin or low red blood cell count in that, and depending on what your doctor decides, the doctor may throw in serum iron and other measures of iron status. The doctor is probably going to make that decision on a case-by-case basis. If she or he believes that you are predisposed to iron loss, they might do that, and they might not do it otherwise. Those tests are actually pretty good. So if you're but also, the doctor has to understand all the nuances of different anemias, and there are some limitations to those tests as well. So if you're dealing with a case, you can have anemia, for example, and you can have normal serum iron, and you would have to do further testing to understand in that case, and you would not catch an early case of iron overload with any of the testing that's done routinely. You'd have to do additional testing on an iron panel to catch an early case of iron overload. In fact, hemochromatosis is generally not diagnosed according to conventional criteria until someone already has organ damage from it.
So one question that comes to my mind is we both have backgrounds in traditional diets and in holistic diets. And how does a person who believes that they're eating a nice broad diet of organic food and grass-finished meats and whatnot wind up with deficiencies?
Well, there's a lot of possibilities. So first of all, everyone has different nutritional needs. And the same diet is sometimes adequate for someone and it's not adequate for someone else. there's also a lot of, also many people don't really understand the nuances of designing a diet necessarily either. So our ancestors had a combination of wisdom accumulated from trial and error about what to eat and how much of it to eat, and had a combination of continuing errors. So, even when Weston Price, your audience is familiar with Price, right? Or should we
Yes.
introduce him?
Yes, but
Okay, so even Weston Price, when he was studying the traditional diets that he studied, although he found remarkable levels of health and a lot of dietary wisdom, he also clearly uncovered evidence of diseases and even nutritional deficiencies. So, for example, when he visited the natives of the Canadian Arctic, he asked them if they knew about scurvy, and they told him that scurvy was a white man's disease. And he said, "Why is scurvy a white man's disease?" And he said, "Well, what we do is when we kill the moose, we take this little ball of fat above the kidney, which isn't a ball of fat, it was an adrenal gland, but it looks like a little ball of fat above the kidney." They said they take this little ball of fat above the kidney and they cut it up into as many as there are little Indians and big Indians in the tribe, and everyone gets an equal piece. And in that way, we prevent scurvy. And the white man don't know about this, and they don't know enough to ask us about it. So that's why the white man gets scurvy. Well, how did they know that prevents scurvy unless they got scurvy? Right? So they have a good method that they figured out how in their environment to prevent scurvy, but they must have had even scurvy in their own generation, because otherwise, how would they know about the signs and symptoms of it enough that Price was able to communicate what the white man was calling scurvy with something that they actually understood? So probably, at a minimum, someone figured it out in previous generations because they got scurvy and passed on the knowledge about how to do that. But, more likely, they had continuing events of scurvy, and they would see, we know this person isn't getting enough of whatever's in that ball of fat above the kidney. Maybe they should get extra. And so they have a preventative approach, but they still know what it is because it happens. But even in that, let's say then that you're someone in the United States in 2018, and you're saying, well, I'm just going to do what they did in traditional diets and all my nutrients are going to be fine. Well, it depends how nuanced your approach is. You can look at that case and you can say, well, the natives of the Canadian Arctic they didn't have many plant foods, so I'm going to go zero carb and this and that. But did you remember to eat your adrenal glands?
right.
So the thing is, sometimes we emulate what we think is significant about a traditional diet, but we aren't familiar with all the nuances. I mean, even Price wrote this book in 1939 first, after spending a couple of years traveling around the world, maybe spending a few months with each of these groups. Now, he was a great researcher, but there are other ethnographers and anthropologists who have spent 8 years with one group, and they give us much more detail about the diets than Price could possibly have uncovered in a few months. That's not a deficiency of Price's work. It's just that you can only, and even in those cases, right? So there was a guy, Moritz Merker, who had spent 8 years with the Maasai at the turn of the 20th century. Even he wouldn't have a full appreciation for the different traditions within the Maasai, because the Maasai aren't a tribe. The Maasai are a federation of tribes, and different groups of Maasai had different traditions. So we take this imperfect understanding about what traditional diets were, and it's not meaningless. It's very meaningful. It's just not comprehensive, because no one knows all the details and nuances of how to navigate that specific approach to the diet unless they were immersed in that culture and grew up with it. So so that's a long-winded first answer to your question about, why could we become nutrient deficient if we're eating traditional diets. And that one is, we may just not be emulating all the necessary requirements because our understanding of how they navigated that particular dietary approach is partial and incomplete. And we may be emphasizing things that we thought were important. And, the other side of that, like on the other side of that is, okay, Price's knowledge was imperfect, but how many people who follow a Weston Price style diet read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration? And out of those people, how many took notes, right? Like hardly anyone, right? Like how many people read it 3 times? Almost no one. But the people who did the second and third time were like, oh, I forgot about that, So like most people have several layers of translation where someone read Price and described what they thought was important about Price's work. And then they read what that person said and incorporated what they thought was important about that person's work, right? Like how many people read Nourishing Traditions? How many people made some recipes from it? How many people read it cover to cover and took notes and then read it again to see what they missed, right? So we're all like, by the time we're doing things in our kitchen, we have numerous layers of one person extracting what they thought was important and leaving behind other pieces that may be important. And so with that imperfect knowledge, we can have nutritional imbalances. But the second and third parts that I can go through more quickly are, some people may have genes that are very well adapted to follow a diet that's designed more like the Arctic diet. Some people may have genes that are much more amenable to thriving on some equatorial diet. Many of us have a mix of genes of different ancestries from different parts of the globe, and we don't actually know what our genes are predisposing us to do well on. So we may not actually fit the mold of any particular diet for what's best for us. We also live in a modern society that may put different stresses on us, right? So we live different lives when we're sedentary versus when we're hunters. We spend different amounts of time outdoors. We have different pollutants in the air. You could go on and on about all these different things that can impact our nutritional status. But then finally, the last thing I would say is, it's not all about diet, right? Recall the hypothetical person that I mentioned at the beginning who became zinc deficient because they had 6 months of diarrhea.
Yeah.
Recall the hypothetical person who had a genetic variant in a zinc transporter that specifically stopped them from absorbing zinc. So there's a lot of reasons why all those kind of conspire to produce many reasons why many of us could not have obvious things leading to deficiencies. And so we all must be mindful to at least understand an approach to general screening to look at whether our diet is in order correctly, and whether any of our health issues, if we have them, look like they might be deficiencies or toxicities. But then, of course, it's also the case that there are many people who have diseases that cause nutritional deficiencies. So there's a whole boatload of issues where, because someone has something wrong with their kidneys, they're losing all of this, or they're accumulating all of that, or because they're being treated with some particular medical treatment for a condition that causes a deficiency of something else. So there are many things where, in a clinical setting, people shouldn't be managing their own nutritional status because it intersects so much with the medical conditions that they need a doctor's help with. But yet those doctors really need to know the ins and outs of the nutrition, because they're dealing with people who are very likely to be nutrient deficient, even if it's not the central feature of their disease. Like, there's a lot of cases where people with some spectrum of disorders, your primary focus is on treating something else, but they're all magnesium deficient or something like that. So those are the main reasons.
So do you want to tell the audience about how they can get a copy of Testing Nutritional Status, the ultimate cheat sheet.
Absolutely.
I'll put a link on the show notes at bdnow.org.
Absolutely. So, first of all, go to chrismasterjohnphd/BD now. That's for Biodynamics Now. And when you get there, you'll see instructions on how to enter your discount code. And your discount code will be Alan Saves 5 in all caps. This is when you go to checkout, you will see a box that says discount. You can copy and paste Alan Saves 5 into that, hit the apply button, and you will see the price drop from 30 to 25. As you watch, make sure you watch the price drop before you complete your order, and that will ensure that you do get the $5 savings. This discount is active upon the release of this podcast, and it expires on February 9th. So go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/BD now. Make sure you use the Alan Saves 5 discount code, and make sure you place your order before February 9th, midnight Eastern time. So get it in there by February 8th.